I was stunned. Susan actually called the police on me just because I wasn't part of her HOA. That's right. She stood there, pointing at my doorbell as if it were some kind of weapon, demanding I rip it out because it supposedly violated her precious community standards. When I calmly told her, "I'm not in your HOA," she completely lost it. This wasn't just a run-in with a control freak. I was up against someone willing to weaponize the police to try and push me out. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done? When I bought that lakefront cabin, I thought I was getting the fresh start I desperately needed. After my divorce drained me, emotionally and financially, I scraped together enough to buy this place. 2 acres of prime lakefront, sheltered by towering oak trees that gave me privacy from the Lakeview subdivision next door. At 35, I thought I had finally found my sanctuary, somewhere no one could dictate how I lived. The morning breeze rolling off the water felt like freedom itself. Those first few days, I spent hours on my dock, just watching the sunrise over the lake. I had done my homework before buying. The realtor mentioned the HOA nearby, but assured me my cabin had been around long before they ever existed. It was clear my property wasn't under their control. So that Tuesday morning, I was in the middle of installing a smart doorbell system when she showed up, out of nowhere, like a self-appointed inspector. Susan Harris, introducing herself as the HOA president, while I still had a drill in my hand. Honestly, I should have seen the red flags immediately. She wore a Navy business suit at 9 a.m., as if she were headed into a corporate boardroom instead of strolling a neighborhood. She clutched a thick black folder to her chest like it contained state secrets or could stop bullets. Her perfectly styled blonde hair didn't budge in the breeze, and her makeup was flawless, not a smudge out of place. Everything about her screamed obsession with control. Still, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just really, really invested in her community? Looking back, I can't believe how naive that was. Susan stepped in way too close, invading my space as her eyes swept over my cabin with obvious disdain. She inspected every detail, the welcome mat, the angle of my porch chairs, the rustic look of the siding, like she was conducting an official inspection I'd never requested. Her comments dripped with judgment. My cabin, she said, didn't match the refined aesthetic of the neighborhood. The longer she stood there, the more invasive it felt. I caught myself clenching my fists, my foot tapping against the porch deck, struggling to keep calm as she pushed every button I had about people who think they can control others. Then she zeroed in on my half-installed doorbell. Pointing at it, she demanded I take it down immediately, insisting it broke privacy standards and endangered neighborhood kids who might be recorded without permission. From the way she said it, you'd think I was setting up a government surveillance system. Instead of just trying to secure my front door after hearing about recent break-ins, out came the folder. She flipped through printed photos, houses where she'd forced owners to remove security cameras, lower fences, even repaint their homes to fit HOA rules. She bragged about each case like they were trophies, clearly rehearsed, like she delivered this exact speech dozens of times before. It made me wonder how many people had caved to her pressure without fighting back. When she reached for my doorbell like she might actually pull it off herself, I stepped forward and told her firmly to keep her hands off my property. I sat down, my tools, pulled out my paperwork, and showed her the deed. It clearly stated the cabin was built in 1987, long before the Lakeview Community HOA formed in 2003. But she barely glanced at it before dismissing it, insisting it didn't matter. According to her, everyone in the area had to follow their standards, membership or not. She spoke about other homeowners who had seen the light after resisting at first, and the way she smiled while describing their surrender made my skin crawl. She lit up when talking about forcing people into compliance, like she thrived on the power. That's when it hit me. This wasn't some random neighborly visit. She'd done her research, studied my property, and come prepared to establish dominance from day one. Her tone turned patronizing as she explained how property values relied on uniformity across the entire lakefront. She warned that my refusal to comply endangered everyone's investment and could trigger a domino effect of violations. Then she dropped her deadline, 48 hours, to fully comply with all community rules. It wasn't phrased as a request. It was a command. And the way she delivered it, like she'd rehearsed in the mirror, was both artificial and absolute. When she waved that folder around to emphasize her arguments, I couldn't help but notice the faint tremor in her hand, a strange detail for someone trying so hard to radiate confidence. I kept my voice steady, even though my patience was fraying, and laid out the truth as plainly as possible. "Ma'am, I'm not a member of your HOA, and your rules don't apply to me." Susan's eyes narrowed with a sharpness that made me half expect her to blow up right there on my porch. Instead, I could see her forcing herself to regain control before launching into a long-winded lecture about community duty and neighborhood values. What became clear during that exchange was Susan's utter refusal to tolerate any challenge to her supposed authority, regardless of how logical or well-supported it might be. She had already done her homework, researching my property lines, preparing violation notices, and even carrying printed photos from her past enforcement wins against other homeowners. Every piece of this confrontation had been staged in advance, from her carefully polished appearance to the folder crammed with documents. As she finally prepared to leave, Susan made sure to bring up the community's legal fund and bragged about their success in cracking down on non-compliant residents. She recounted those victories with the same smug pride she showed when describing her earlier triumphs. Before walking away, she threw me a smirk that told me exactly what I needed to know. This wasn't about protecting the neighborhood. It was about control, pure power. I watched her march back toward the HOA subdivision with near military discipline already running through my own next steps. But just as she reached the edge of my property, she stopped, turned, and said coldly, "I'll be back. And you'll regret this, Mr. Miller." The smile she wore as she disappeared down the road made it clear I'd just made myself a dangerous adversary. For 3 days, everything stayed quiet. I almost convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, Susan had decided to respect my rights and back off. That Saturday morning, I was outside washing my Honda Civic, soaking in the peaceful lake breeze, even considering grilling burgers later in the day. The water shimmered under the sunlight, and the distant laughter of children carried across the lake. For the first time since my divorce, I felt truly at ease, hopeful about the future. Then, out of nowhere, 2 police cruisers tore down my street, sirens screaming and lights blazing like a scene ripped from a crime drama. The sudden chaos transformed my quiet lakeside home into something that felt like the finale of a cop show. I froze, sponge slipping from my hand, stunned by the idea that this emergency could somehow involve me. Neighbors shuffled out of their homes, some still in robes, drawn by the noise and probably wondering what crime I could have possibly committed. The whole moment felt unreal, like I was watching from the outside instead of living through it. Officers Roberts and Thompson stepped from their vehicles, serious but composed, clearly seasoned professionals who'd seen more than their share of strange calls. They explained they'd been dispatched for reported safety violations and a resident threatening community security. None of it made sense, considering I'd just been washing my car in peace for the past hour. Even before they said much, I could tell from their skeptical glances that they were already doubting the validity of the report. And then, right on cue, Susan emerged. She hurried out like she had been waiting by the window for this exact moment. She carried her usual regulation. Binder plus another folder stuffed with papers. The timing was too perfect to be anything but orchestrated. It hit me. She had staged the entire event, calling the police herself and preparing every shred of evidence to back up her claims. She had practically turned the act of calling 911 into a tactical mission, complete with documentation and a rehearsed narrative. Her earlier threats suddenly felt very real. Susan had found a way to weaponize the police against me, all because I'd installed a doorbell on my own house. Without missing a beat, she launched into a performance, insisting my security cameras were illegally spying on neighborhood kids and violating privacy laws without the required consent. She demanded that the officers enforce community safety rules immediately, treating it as if I posed some escalating danger. The way she addressed those officers, you'd think she was their superior officer, not a civilian with a complaint. Her tone dripped with authority, as if her words alone should be enough to put me in cuffs. She rattled off municipal codes and state privacy statutes, clearly having prepped her legal arsenal before dialing the police. Officer Roberts kept calm and professional, but I could see him starting to recognize this wasn't the emergency they'd been summoned to handle. Still, Susan refused to stop talking, interrupting everyone, even the police themselves. It came across as shockingly disrespectful, considering these men were just doing their jobs. The whole thing was making the crowd of neighbors restless, too. Susan kept hammering the same accusations again and again, almost as if she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to persuade the officers. I noticed both cops growing more irritated with every repetitive claim. Finally, Officer Roberts turned to me directly and asked about my HOA status. I met his eyes, steady and certain, and replied, "Officer, I'm not in the HOA, and I've got the deed to prove it." Susan immediately cut me off, raising her voice to argue that membership didn't matter, that the entire lakefront had to follow her community's standards, whether I joined or not. She waved her binder around as though it held more weight than county land records or state law. The officers shared a knowing look, the kind seasoned cops give when they've seen this kind of neighborhood power struggle before. Then Officer Thompson pulled out his mobile terminal to check the county property records himself. I couldn't help but appreciate their diligence and professionalism, especially amid the circus Susan had orchestrated. Her face turned redder. With each passing moment, as it became obvious, the police weren't automatically siding with her. For the first time, I caught a flicker of doubt in her expression. Was there a chance I'd overlooked something, some fine print that might actually make me guilty? Could a legal loophole somehow give Susan real authority? The doubt ate at me while Officer Thompson reviewed my paperwork. The database check confirmed every word I'd told them. My deed carried no HOA membership, no covenants, no restrictions, nothing at all. Officer Thompson explained in a steady professional tone that police cannot enforce HOA rules on non-members and that Susan had zero legal power over my property or my security system. He spoke slowly, almost like he was teaching a basic civics lesson to someone who really should have known better. Susan's reaction was instant and explosive. She flat out refused to accept the ruling from sworn officers. She challenged their competence, demanded a supervisor, and accused them of failing the community by letting my supposed violations stand. She was openly arguing with uniformed police in the middle of the street, a choice I couldn't do. Believe anyone thought was wise. Officer Thompson's patience was clearly thinning. He cautioned Susan about abusing emergency services for personal disputes that belonged in civil court, not on a 911 line. Neighbors had gathered, watching their HOA president go head-to-head with police. The social tide shifted right in front of me. I stayed calm, fully cooperative with the officers, a sharp contrast to Susan's escalating hostility. Several residents looked embarrassed, as if realizing their community leader's version of events might not have been truthful. Kids on bikes stopped to watch. I felt bad they had to see grown-ups acting this dysfunctional. The whole thing felt like a reality TV episode, only it was happening in my driveway and shattering the peace I'd worked so hard to find. Officer Roberts stepped in, advising Susan to pursue disagreements through the proper legal process. He warned her, too, about the consequences of making false emergency reports. His voice was firm, professional. A clear signal the conversation had to end before Susan pushed herself into deeper legal trouble. As the officers prepared to leave, Susan delivered one last statement that froze me, despite the bright morning sun. She stared straight at me, eyes cold and calculating. "Police can't be everywhere, Mr. Miller." It sounded less like an observation and more like a promise. The way she emphasized my name told me she dug deeper than just property records, probably into my personal history, maybe even finances. Officer Thompson caught the threat, turned back, and warned her once again about harassment. She brushed it off with a sugary smile, insisting she'd only been making a simple point about rural police coverage. Watching her flip from aggressive to innocent victim mode was genuinely unsettling. When the patrol cars finally drove away, neighbors trickled back to their Saturday routines, but the tension still hung thick in the air. I went back to washing my car in silence, trying to process what had just unfolded and wondering what Susan might try next. The peaceful lakefront. Morning was ruined, and I knew this conflict had only begun. As Susan walked home, she muttered just loud enough for me to catch, "You can't escape the HOA, not forever, Mr. Miller." The look she gave me afterward suggested she knew something I didn't. After that stunt with the police, I realized ignoring her wouldn't work anymore. If she could weaponize law enforcement over a doorbell, I needed to understand the legal backbone of her HOA, so I took a day off work, grabbed my laptop and a coffee, and drove to the county courthouse to dig into public records. The building reeked of old paper and bureaucracy. The records clerk barely looked up from her crossword as I explained what I needed, clearly unimpressed with some guy trying to fight his HOA. After 20 minutes of back and forth, she finally, reluctantly, pulled the documents for Lakeview Communities Incorporation. What I uncovered over the next 4 hours would change everything. The original incorporation papers were riddled with problems. Lakeview Community HOA had been created in 2003, but the plat maps didn't line up with their claimed boundaries. The developer, Lakeside Properties LLC, had gone bankrupt during the HOA's formation, leaving major gaps in the required filings. Signatures were missing from key documents. Boundary descriptions conflicted with official survey maps. And at least 6 properties within their so-called territory had never signed membership agreements. Yet Susan had treated those homeowners like unwilling participants for years. It made me question whether this HOA had any legitimate standing at all, or if Susan was simply running a power play on fraudulent grounds. Just as I felt I was making headway, a new obstacle appeared. A man in an expensive suit introduced himself as Bradley Harrison, attorney for Lakeview Community HOA. His timing was too perfect, making me wonder if Susan had people watching the courthouse. Harrison seemed surprised to find me digging through formation records. He dismissed my efforts as a waste of time, saying I had no chance of challenging the authority of established community leadership. He spoke about winning cases that upheld HOA rights against private homeowners, delivering his points with such certainty that it made me second-guess all the research I'd done. There was something unsettling in the way he carried himself. It set off warning signals in my head. When he offered to personally examine my property deed, suggesting he might notice flaws I had overlooked, I declined as politely as I could, gathered my paperwork, and left quickly. Still, I wondered, had I misunderstood something about my legal standing? When I returned home, a notice was taped to my door. It accused me of disrupting community peace and causing anxiety among residents, all because of my research efforts. To make matters worse, Susan had turned my trip to the courthouse into a $200 violation. The same notice claimed I was guilty of excessive legal consultation, as though hiring an attorney endangered neighborhood stability. It was clear Susan had eyes everywhere. Her loyal circle of neighbors fed her updates like informants. By now, her stack of fabricated violations had climbed to nearly $2,000, all because I had installed security equipment and dared to defend my own rights. I had to admit, her creativity was impressive, but so was her complete disregard for reality. My investigation widened. Beyond courthouse files, I began interviewing longtime residents who remembered the neighborhood before Susan's rise to power. Margaret Foster, an elderly woman 2 streets away, invited me over for coffee and shared the story of how the HOA came into existence. Susan had pushed for its creation shortly after moving in back in 2002, persuading homeowners that it would protect property values. The original charter had only limited authority over a small area, but Susan slowly expanded its reach year by year. Margaret explained how families eventually moved away, choosing to sell rather than endure Susan's relentless harassment. The same pattern of legal intimidation stretched back more than 15 years, Susan using the HOA as her personal empire. County. Records confirmed even more troubling inconsistencies with the HOA's legitimacy and territorial claims. At the building permit office, I found no evidence the HOA had ever approved the construction of its own clubhouse, something required if they truly governed that land. Zoning departments were split. Some recognized the HOA, others had no record of it at all. It felt like one of those films where a person invents a company out of thin air, then wills it into reality with sheer audacity and paperwork tricks. I spent countless hours copying documents, photographing records, and compiling a case file that highlighted glaring weaknesses in Susan's authority. Piece by piece, the evidence convinced me that her years of neighborhood dominance rested on shaky, legally questionable foundations. Her desperation became clearer as her tactics escalated. She tried pulling in the city council, claiming my resistance was a matter of public safety. She filed bogus inspection reports accusing my security system of violating electrical codes, only for inspectors to confirm everything was up to standard. She circulated petitions alleging I was a threat to children and property values, but struggled to gather signatures from anyone who had actually seen me do anything wrong. At community clubhouse meetings, she even presented PowerPoint slides, casting me as some sort of domestic terrorist, simply because I refused to follow rules that didn't apply to my land. Her efforts at manufacturing outrage were inventive, but the frantic edge to them revealed she was running out of real leverage. Then came an anonymous phone call one evening that changed everything. The voice warned me Susan was preparing something far more extreme than fines and complaints. Each document I uncovered left me asking the same question. What truth was Susan so terrified I would stumble upon? That night, I finally faced a task I had avoided since moving into the cabin, sorting through my father's estate boxes, untouched and gathering dust for months. My father, David Miller Sr., had died 18 months earlier from pancreatic cancer, and I still hadn't organized the business and investment records the estate attorney had asked me to review. Sitting on the hardwood floor, surrounded by bankers' boxes and manila folders, the grief weighed on me again, mixed with guilt for leaving his affairs neglected this long. Some papers still carried the faint scent of his cologne, pulling me back to memories of Sunday mornings when he would sit at the kitchen table, carefully reviewing his real estate holdings and business ventures. He had always been diligent with records, keeping meticulous files on every deal and transaction throughout his successful career. I had inherited his eye for detail, though not his discipline when it came to organization, especially while dealing with the emotional wreckage of loss. As I worked through his investment files in order, I realized my father had been far more active in local real estate than I had ever known. His files stretched back 25 years, documenting numerous property acquisitions throughout the county, including several undeveloped parcels near the lake, the very area where I now lived. Letters and business correspondence revealed his long-term strategy, buying undervalued waterfront land and holding it until development opportunities arose. The maps and surveys in his files showed he had pieced together an impressive portfolio of lakefront and near lakefront properties, some of which appeared dangerously close to the very spot where the HOA clubhouse now stood. His handwritten notes outlined plans for a retirement community that would embrace the area's serene landscape and natural charm. The financial crash of 2008 had forced him to shelve the project indefinitely, but he held onto the land, convinced that one day conditions would improve enough to bring his vision to life. As I sifted through his journals and business blueprints, I was hit with a bittersweet wave of pride and sorrow for the dreams he never got to realize. His design for the lakeside property included winding walking paths, shared gardens, and recreation, spaces that would enrich not only residents, but also the wider community. In letters to county officials, he stressed his dedication to protecting the environment and following sustainable building practices that would preserve the delicate lake ecosystem. His heart was in creating something lasting and beneficial for all, not simply chasing profit. Tucked into file folders were photographs of untouched land, scenes I now recognized from my daily neighborhood walks. Some pictures captured the very ground where Susan's beloved clubhouse stands today, back when it was just open land, dotted with wildflowers and native trees. The emotional impact of seeing those unfulfilled plans preserved in faded photos and brittle papers nearly knocked the wind out of me. Buried beneath stacks of tax records, I stumbled upon the property deed, and my heart stopped cold. My father had owned 5 acres, including the precise spot where Susan's clubhouse now sat, land he purchased in 1998 for his lakeside development dream. The deed clearly mapped out boundaries that covered not only my current cabin, but also the entire parcel where HOA meetings and community gatherings now took place. Even survey stakes in his handwriting still marked the lines, perfectly matching what the legal records confirmed. Suddenly, everything snapped into focus with frightening clarity. Susan's clubhouse had been built entirely on my family's property. For 15 years, she'd held meetings, enforced rules, and intimidated neighbors on land she never legally owned. The very woman who had hounded me over HOA compliance was running her entire operation from a building illegally planted on my father's investment. The realization flipped my role instantly, from harassed target to rightful landlord holding the keys to Susan's empire. Every meeting she conducted, every policy she pushed, every intimidation campaign she waged, all of it unfolded on my family's land. The irony was so sharp, it felt like something out of a perfectly scripted novel. Susan Harris, the self-appointed enforcer of rules I was never bound to, had been trespassing on my father's property for over a decade, wielding power she never legitimately possessed. I couldn't help but laugh, even as the seriousness of the situation sank in, imagining her face when she learned that the headquarters she cherished wasn't hers at all. Then the financial reality hit me like a thunderclap. That building had hosted weddings, birthdays, committee meetings, and countless social functions for years, all generating value for the HOA without a dime of rent paid to the actual owner. By market standards, 15 years of unpaid commercial use added up to 6 figures or more. Liability that could financially cripple an HOA already bleeding money from legal battles. My attorney would have a field day pursuing damages for unauthorized property use, especially given Susan's relentless harassment of the rightful owner. If she had any personal assets, they too could be on the line. Knowing this, I moved quickly to preserve evidence, photographing every deed, survey, and plan, then creating digital backups. Licensed surveyors would be needed to verify boundaries and confirm beyond dispute that the clubhouse sat squarely on our land. Legal counsel could then advise me on eviction rights and back rent claims against unauthorized occupants who had profited from property they didn't own. The documents painted a clear picture of organized property theft masked as community leadership, opening doors to both civil and possibly criminal consequences. The discovery left me shaken, but also fueled with a sense of justice. This fight was no longer just about my own harassment. It had become about safeguarding my father's legacy. Susan's endless violation notices now felt like insults to the sacrifices my father had made for this land and the community's future. For the first time, I understood that defending this property wasn't just about me. It was about finishing what he had started decades ago. His dream of building something meaningful could still be honored, even if in a different form than he originally envisioned. That weight was heavy, but it gave me resolve far stronger than any petty neighborhood feud could. Studying his old plans, I realized this battle wasn't only about land rights anymore. With proof of Susan's non-existent authority, I shifted, from defending myself to actively connecting with neighbors. Though the fight often felt isolating, Miller's Cafe became my base for gathering community sentiment. Free from Susan's watchful eyes, people finally spoke openly about their frustrations. I made it a habit to show up around 7:30 each morning, sipping coffee and listening as residents vented. Over time, I came to see that Susan's grip on the neighborhood was built on intimidation, not loyalty, and the cracks were widening. Still, I couldn't shake the tension of knowing everyone was waiting to see if I'd survive her enforcement machine. My first ally was Bob Thompson. What started? A small talk about fishing on the lake turned into stories of HOA torment. Bob, a retired electrician in his 70s, had watched Susan harass his elderly mother for 3 relentless years before she finally moved into assisted living. Her supposed offense had been parking her Buick at a slight angle in her driveway, violating Susan's rigid rules about vehicle appearance. The harassment escalated into daily violation letters, unannounced inspections, and constant legal threats, stress that wore his mother down until her health declined. Bob's anger was raw, and it was clear he'd been waiting for someone strong enough to finally stand up to Susan's reign. When I showed him my research, exposing irregularities in how the HOA was formed, his expression brightened with hope. As we spoke about what this battle meant, I admitted my deepest fear, that I could lose everything, even the quiet refuge I'd finally found after my divorce. Carol Jensen, a single mom raising twins while working exhausting night shifts at the hospital, confided her own ordeal with the infamous garden gnome rules. Over just 6 months, Susan had hit her with 17 violation notices, insisting her ceramic gnomes were visual clutter that supposedly threatened neighborhood property values. The fines piled up faster than Carol could possibly pay them, pushing her into endless overtime just to keep up with Susan's arbitrary penalties. The fatigue showed in her eyes as she described checking her garden every morning in dread, bracing herself for another notice that would drive her further into debt. Her story revealed a disturbing pattern. Susan deliberately targeted vulnerable homeowners who lacked the resources to fight back, turning them into easy victims of her hunger for control. When Carol heard about the property deed discoveries, pad made, tears welled in her eyes. For the first time, she realized someone had the means to push back effectively. A few days later, Janet Stevens, the HOA treasurer, approached me at the post office. She looked uneasy, but determined to share what she knew about financial misconduct under Susan's leadership. Janet, a CPA who'd moved here 5 years ago, had been raising questions about shady budget practices and unexplained spending, questions Susan always sidestepped. Special assessments were imposed without a vote, and Susan's personal legal. Bills were charged to HOA funds without board approval. The ledgers showed thousands drained on harassment lawsuits against homeowners like me, money that should have gone toward community improvements. With her professional background, Janet couldn't ignore the red flags, but Susan's retaliatory tactics had made her too afraid to speak up in public. Sharing her concerns privately was a risky move, but it signaled cracks forming in Susan's inner circle. Still, Janet hesitated, as if weighing whether to reveal something even more explosive. I could sense she was holding something back. Then came Margaret Foster, whose long memory became invaluable to me, though our alliance would face a test. Margaret had lived here for 4 decades, back when the lakefront was nothing but camping land. She recalled how Susan methodically isolated anyone who questioned her authority, using threats of lawsuits and social exclusion to turn a once cooperative neighborhood into one ruled by fear, Margaret's network of long-timers, though too afraid to speak out individually, might act together if they believed change was possible. Her influence gave me the foundation to rally support against Susan's manufactured authority. But during one of our coffee talks, Margaret admitted she was second-guessing her involvement. Fear of retaliation against her fixed-income housing weighed heavily, and I realized even the most trusted allies carried conflicting priorities, leaving their loyalty uncertain. Not long after, Michelle Davis, the HOA secretary, asked to meet me privately behind the boat launch, where no one could eavesdrop. A mother of 2, working part-time as a paralegal, Michelle confessed her growing discomfort with the wave of violation notices she was forced to process. Her position gave her an inside view of Susan's methods, which often bypassed board input and broke the bylaws outright. She felt like a reluctant accomplice to Susan's vendettas against anyone daring to push back. The stress was spilling into her family life and damaging her professional reputation, leaving her wondering if staying involved in such a corrupt system was worth it. Then Michelle delivered the blow that made my stomach drop. She admitted she had been relaying information from our conversations back to Susan, not out of loyalty, but because Susan had threatened to go after her family. Next, the betrayal hit me like a punch, realizing my most trusted insider had been compromised from the very start. That's when Susan's counterintelligence operation became clear. Her surveillance tactics were sophisticated, designed to cut me off from potential supporters. Loyalists shadowed my movements, reporting in unnerving detail about casual coffee shop talks or simple neighborhood walks. Susan fueled rumors that I was plotting commercial development to tank property values, exploiting residents' fear of overbuilding. She staged friendly coffee meetings with her supporters, specifically to disrupt my conversations and dissuade others from engaging. Warning letters were sent to families who'd spoken with me, threatening that associating with a so-called disruptive element could affect their assessments and standing. She had twisted the community into a surveillance network over a doorbell dispute. Her web of informants ran far deeper than I had realized, making me second-guess every interaction. But her growing desperation was also making her careless, and careless people make mistakes. It was time for a public showdown. I formally requested an HOA board meeting to present my findings and demand accountability for the months of harassment and manipulation. Susan agreed with visible confidence, clearly believing this would be my final act of resistance before I bowed to her control. She had spent weeks orchestrating her defense, rallying supporters, and preparing to brand me as a menace to community welfare and property values. On the night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. Some residents came. Out of genuine curiosity, others stood firm in Susan's camp, ready to defend her authority. I arrived with 3 boxes of evidence, a certified surveyor's report, and a real estate attorney specializing in HOA law and covenant disputes. The atmosphere was electric, more like a courtroom drama than a community meeting. The outcome poised it to reshape everyone's future here. Methodically, I laid out 6 months' worth of persecution, documenting every violation notice, legal threat, and manipulation Susan had inflicted on me, my family, and my home. The timeline itself told a devastating story. What began as legitimate neighborhood concerns had spiraled into obsessive harassment, far beyond any proper jurisdiction. Members of the coalition testified about Susan's long history of oppression, recounting years of calculated abuse against families who dared challenge her authority or resist her grip on control. Margaret Foster bravely offered her perspective on how the neighborhood had shifted, from one of neighborly cooperation to an atmosphere of fearful obedience under Susan's authoritarian rule. Bob Thompson's account of his mother's mistreatment moved residents to tears, laying bare the real human toll of Susan's power games in a way everyone could feel. Together, the evidence revealed a chilling truth. Organizational authority had been systematically hijacked for Susan's personal satisfaction, not for legitimate community governance. As professional documentation and resident testimony piled up, board members grew visibly uneasy. Susan's unauthorized behavior was now undeniable. Janet Stevens laid out proof of financial irregularities, unauthorized legal spending, and procedural breaches that put the entire organization at risk of severe liability and possible regulatory penalties. Michelle Davis confirmed that Susan had been making unilateral enforcement decisions, bypassing board approval and ignoring their own bylaws. The legal committee quickly realized the danger. They were exposed to enormous legal risk from persecution campaigns launched without lawful authority or foundation. Worse still, insurance coverage would likely be denied, as these actions clearly exceeded the bounds of legitimate HOA activity. That meant board members themselves could be held personally liable for damages and legal costs. Even Susan's loyal supporters began to realize they might have to foot the bill for her vendetta against residents who had never actually broken any rules. And then came the moment that shattered everything Susan had built. I presented my father's original property deed from 2 decades ago, backed by professional surveys showing the clubhouse sat entirely on land my family owned, long before the HOA even existed. A legal opinion confirmed that the organization had been trespassing for 15 years with absolutely no right to occupy or use the property. Every meeting, every event, every decision that had taken place within those walls had occurred illegally on private land without the owner's consent. The revelation struck like a thunderclap. Residents suddenly grasped that their community's entire structure rested on legal fiction and outright property theft. Susan's empire crumbled before their eyes as she frantically searched the maps and legal records for some loophole to preserve her authority. Her expression shifted from disbelief to denial to rage, and finally to sheer panic as reality closed in. Licensed surveyors and real estate attorneys confirmed the findings beyond question. There was no room for reinterpretation. The lease signing had been formalized at the county courthouse before witnesses, including Margaret Foster, Bob Thompson, and several neighbors. Susan had tried to negotiate, but my attorney insisted on full market rates for commercial space, particularly after 15 years of unauthorized use. The rent, $200 a month, was 3 times what the HOA had been informally contributing, forcing them to impose special assessments on members. Her hand shook as she signed the agreement, legally acknowledging my authority over the property. She once used to dominate. Watching her hand me the first check felt like the final act of a story where justice defeats tyranny. At precisely 9 twice she knocked, hoping to complete the humiliating task before neighbors could witness her submission. I let her wait. 30 seconds passed before I responded, stretching out the moment when the very woman who had spent months trying to drive me out now stood before me, asking for permission to use my property. She couldn't hold my gaze as she handed over the envelope, muttering something about October's rent and hoping continued use of the facility wouldn't be a problem. The irony couldn't have been sharper. This was the same person who once threatened me with police action over a doorbell, now reduced to a tenant seeking my approval. For Susan, the consequences weren't just financial. They went deeper, reshaping her entire life. Legal fees from her failed crusade to oust me had crossed $25,000. Money wasted on a fight she could never win, since my legal position was solid from the start. When the board unanimously stripped her of all leadership roles, she lost not only her authority, but also the sense of belonging and identity she had built over 15 years. Members then demanded repayment for unauthorized legal costs she had charged to the community, pushing her into even tougher choices about her future. Her once polished image as a respected leader was shattered, replaced by the reputation of someone who had abused organizational power for personal grudges. Under new leadership, the community quickly saw how much damage her authoritarian control had inflicted on relationships. Janet Stevens, elected as the new president, immediately introduced open budgeting and decision-making that actually included input from members rather than decrees from above. Rule enforcement shifted to genuine safety concerns instead of petty aesthetic battles used to assert dominance. The climate of fear that had smothered the neighborhood for years finally began to lift. Parents no longer worried about retaliation for minor slip-ups. Kids played outside freely, and neighbors started talking again rather than spying and reporting. Margaret. Foster later organized a community dinner to thank me for challenging Susan's abuse of authority and uncovering the shaky foundation of her control. The event took place in the clubhouse, my property, now legitimately and generously made available for community gatherings under proper agreements. Residents shared their own stories of mistreatment under Susan, creating a sense of collective healing and reminding everyone that they hadn't suffered alone. That night, Bob Thompson presented me with a plaque recognizing my defense of property rights and community freedom. The inscription thanked me for standing tall when others were too afraid to resist. The entire evening felt like a celebration of liberation, closing the chapter on years of oppression. The legal precedent set by my case soon became a resource for other homeowners dealing with similar harassment from overreaching associations. Attorney Wells used my case as a model in defending property rights, helping families across the region push back against intimidation. My fight had shown that these power plays could be beaten if homeowners had solid legal support. Local news picked up the story, shining a light on how unchecked homeowner associations could exploit their authority. Real estate attorneys began using my case in seminars, teaching future homeowners how to protect themselves. For me, the true satisfaction didn't come from Susan's downfall, but from knowing I had safeguarded my father's investment and preserved his vision. The rental income created steady revenue that honored his memory while keeping the clubhouse open for legitimate community use. What had once been his interrupted dream of development became something different, a lasting contribution that served neighbors while upholding property rights. Often found myself sitting on the dock where he once dreamed of walking trails, feeling grateful for the strength he somehow passed down to me, the strength that allowed me to finish what he started decades earlier. That autumn morning, as I stood by the lake watching the sunrise over waters that had seen everything, from my father's hopes to Susan's final defeat, I felt a sense of completion and peace. The same smart doorbell that sparked this conflict still kept watch at my front door, now guarding a home free from harassment. Susan's rent checks would keep arriving, each one a reminder that power built without legitimacy collapses when confronted with truth and persistence. The neighborhood had learned that courage from one individual can dismantle institutional bullying, and that property rights are the backbone of freedom, protecting everyone from tyranny. As I stood there, the weight of it all finally lifted. The cabin, the lake, my father's legacy, it had all been worth it. Susan's schemes had failed, undone by her own arrogance, yet the greatest realization wasn't just about her defeat. It was this: no matter how hard someone tries to impose control, it cannot endure if truth and integrity stand beneath it. Hold firm to your principles, and you can survive any storm. Maybe that's the real victory, not merely toppling a tyrant, but proving that standing for what's right can shift the entire course of events. If you've read this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in my place?